Hello, I'm Karika Anashuk, and I want to be presenting a topic that's really important to me, which is healthy intimacy at work. And I think that we have a broad spectrum of, in ministry jobs in particular, of feeling like we need to be too close or feeling like we can't be close enough. And so I'd like to explore that today. Just what are ethical levels of vulnerability when you are a pastor or you're working at a church, between peers, between subordinate and supervisors, really just everyone at work. So we're gonna go on a little journey and take a little road trip. So first, let's just define the problem. Ministerial jobs are different because they often require blurred lines between career and church relationships. And what I mean by that is our because it's completely heart-based and passion, and because your church is not only your place of employment, but your church is also the place that you should be able to feel safe and worship God, and grow in your relationship with Him. There's just a lot of overlap there that doesn't happen in other normal jobs. And we see that Jesus modeled intimacy that I personally think we would be uncomfortable with in 2020 in America. He shared his time, he shared his space, he shared his thoughts. He, traveled for 3 years with 12 other men, and honestly, a lot of other men and women who just followed him. But at the same time, Jesus also modeled boundaries that I think that we feel in general very unequipped to set, and we don't know how to set the right ones without going too far overboard in one direction or the other. And so because there's kind of these two things that are juxtapositioned together, there's just this tension there. And I would love to maybe get a little further today in how we solve that. So why it matters is really important. We can either be too distant from one another, or we can be too close to one another. And when we're too distant, we see teams not mesh together. We see subordinates not trust their superiors. We see projects just kind of going at a snail's pace or just not being done really well. Or individuals just working so hard that burnout's high. They don't feel like they have much relational capital with other people, or they're not really connecting. They don't enjoy their job. And ultimately, personal relationships with Christ and with the church at large just end up regressing. But when we're too close to one another, that's also really dangerous too. And I think we hear more about that, especially in the news, because that's when sometimes moral failings occur, or we don't get as much done. And we're really meant to be good stewards of the time that we're given, because we're working with God's money. And yeah, we're paid to do this. We still want to do it really, really well. And so some teams, they're so close that it's really almost more of a friend group than it is really getting things done for the betterment of the church. And we see that superiors and subordinates just are sometimes too close or enmeshed, or maybe you'll have one peer where silos start to be formed, or 2 or 3 people gather and they become cliquey, and then that makes trust really hard on teams, and it ends up again personally or damaging personal relationships with Christ or with the church. And so this can happen at all different levels on the spectrum, but that's why it really, really matters that we kind of get this right, because what's at stake is, like I talked about, ineffectiveness, congregational trust in God and His leaders. If we are making moral, unethical, immoral choices, then our congregation has a right to distrust us. And because we are representatives of God, then that often leads to them not trusting that Christianity is really real, or that we really need to follow God's laws. And then sometimes if we have too much intimacy on a team, that's not necessarily sexual or anything in nature, but just really connected, then we can end up having just inbred ideas. And so there's no lack of change. There's no, you start to kind of group think starts to happen. And so you're not really asking for any input from outside sources. And then abuse and neglect can happen on both sides of the spectrum. So, abuse can happen when two people feel so close, especially in a superior subordinate relationship, when one person ends up using information or using their relationship to manipulate the other person into either doing things or spending their time in ways that they shouldn't be. Or neglect can also happen, which is a really big deal, especially in ministerial jobs, where I think that the church still has a duty to its employees to be a safe place. And so if you're not that safe place, if your leader is not asking about how your relationship with God is going, then I do think that there's some neglect that happens. And again, those people who God has really put on their heart to serve him and to dedicate their whole life to that can then feel like the same way that congregations can feel when they just feel like their leaders aren't acting like Christians. So when someone doesn't care about you as a person, even if you're on staff and you know that they're your boss, if they're not seeming interested in how your own spiritual life is going, then that also can impact you in your relationship with Christ. So we need appropriate modeling because Jesus Christ did that for us. He came to earth because we couldn't understand how much God loved us and our relationship with him. And as pastors, we're supposed to be able to show that to not only our team, but to our church. And so that's at stake. Individual careers are at stake. Again, both ends of the spectrum, where someone can just feel like, I know for me personally, there have been times when I felt like maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I don't really love Christ as much as I thought, because there's this lack of passion that I feel is gone because I'm working at a church and it's not a safe place for me to talk about maybe what I'm struggling with or what I'm thinking, or no one cares because it's all business. And I just don't have that outlet, and I don't have it in a small group because of the culture of our church is very high leader focused. And so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to share how I'm doing. So there's individual careers on that side of the spectrum of it. Like if there's not enough intimacy, someone's career can just tank because they feel like maybe they've lost their calling. Maybe they were wrong about it. But then on the other side of the spectrum, careers can tank because intimacy was way too close and either gossip set in or immoral behavior started happening. And so then one or more people end up losing their career and a lot more because of that. So that bleeds into moral character. And then I think this is a big one, missed relationships and opportunities. I think that there are so many times, whether it's between people who work at the church and congregates, or between two peers that are working on the same team, or between a leader and their subordinate or their direct reports. There's so many opportunities for people to grow, for people to learn, for people to become more diverse in their thinking, relationships that feel almost God ordained sometimes happen at work or within the church. And when we don't open up, or we just kind of put our axe to the grind, I think is the term, then we miss out on those relationships or those opportunities for us to grow or for us to help someone else grow. So at the church that I worked at most recently, there were current measures that were put into place, and they had kind of varied effectiveness. So one rule was no opposite gender one-on-one meetings outside of church walls. And excuse me. This didn't work for several reasons. One, if people want to meet outside of the church walls, regardless of whether or not there's a rule about it, it's going to happen. But also, the leaders, the head pastor, the pastor of ministry, so the one that's kind of over most of the staff, different managers, they would meet with their subordinates outside of work for coffee, because they were in between meetings and they couldn't rush all the way back to the church. And they felt, I guess, that they were outside of that rule. So there would be one-off meetings that would happen that way. And then I think maybe even a bigger issue is that, especially in American church right now, it's very male dominant. And so there's half of the congregation who's female who need to be cared for. And so when we make this rule, then we're really telling our congregation, hey, if you need help from a male, who's maybe better suited to meet your needs, you need to come here. You need to come to us. We're not going to meet with you where you're at. And the church that I was at, there were a lot of elderly people who would have trouble driving or getting to church. And so that kind of happened with effectiveness. I don't really think that that was a great rule to have in place because it just wasn't consistent. A second measure was our emails were monitored, and we knew that. We knew that our manager could see them, and that felt, I think it set the stage for distrust already. Like, if you don't trust us and you're monitoring emails, then what, are you, you're counting how many emails we're sending out in a day as if that's part of us working hard, and you're seeing who we talk the most to. And then for me, that felt like, if there was a specific congregant that I was having to work more closely with for a season, or that really was just more needy at the time, then that was always in the back of my head, like, oh, what will someone think, or what will my boss think if he sees that, oh, I've had to send like 20 emails in the last 2 weeks to this person. And so then I would feel the need to go and preface that to my boss and say, hey, just so you know, I'm working more close, and that just ends up, it just doesn't breed trust. So we also shared work calendars all with each other. I think that was a very effective guideline to have in place. And then there were windows on all doors, which I also think was really effective, because it protected the people inside, but also protected the people outside from maybe thinking that something was happening that shouldn't be happening. Another guideline was no emotional conversations. And I think or between, no emotional conversations between men and women. And I think that that's impossible and wrong. All conversations should have emotion in it, and especially in ministry positions, our entire hearts should be in what we're doing. And so it's really hard to separate that from your work. And I know that this guideline was meant as, no like crying conversations, no like really heavy stuff. But even that, there's just this mixed or blurred line between, I'm passionate about what Christ is doing in this area, and maybe this is something that feels really dry for me right now, but I'm having to minister to somebody that needs to hear X, Y, and Z, and I don't know how to do that in an authentic manner. And then another guideline was no co-led opposite gender mission trips. And again, I think that this does not serve the congregation well, because on a mission trip, so many things happen on mission trips where I think that they need, the women need a woman to go to, and the men need a man to go to sometimes. And so saying that a female and a male cannot co-lead a mission trip just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And again, it just sets the stage of like, we don't trust you enough to make wise decisions. And then no opposite gender carpooling. Again, this was similar to the first guideline. It was hard to keep because the amount of elderly people that were there, they would need rides, and because most of the staff were men, that would be broken then. So then there were different circumstances where it was like, oh no, of course that's fine, but then that would end up, you can always rationalize anything. So maybe you're on your way to a retreat or a conference, and the two people that have signed up going, it's an hour away, and so it's like, oh well, that's okay if we carpool instead of um, instead of both of us having to drive. And so then when there would be certain times that was okay and certain times that wasn't, people just didn't take that seriously at all because leaders weren't showing that that was actually a guideline that they wanted to get behind. So there were some measures that were considered. One was calendar accuracy in public view settings. And again, I think that that's a great guideline. And so this just means the difference between what the rule was, which is just that shared calendars were a thing. This measure would have been that everything needs to be on your calendar. And so although we did not implement it, I think that this would have been a very great tool to use, because it not only helps people with their own time management, but it helps teams know when we can meet with one another and where people are and what they're doing. Then we have wisdom guided situational expectations. And I think that this is a great idea. And I think that it breeds trust. But I also think that, if someone wants to, you can't guarantee that people are always going to use their wise mind. And so the choices, the poor choices that people have made, probably didn't seem super poor to them at the time, and then it ends up getting them into a bad position. So, excuse me. No opposite gender work partnerships or reporting structures. This was considered and thankfully not put into place. And I don't think that's a good idea because, again, it's just not possible in a male centric job. It's, you can't have only females reporting to females and males reporting to males. I also don't think that it's I think that obviously God made men and women, and we have so much that we can learn from one another. And so to say that we can only learn from half of the people in the world just seems unwise to me. And then department check-ins were something that was also considered, but we did not implement. And I think that that would be a really great idea. Department check-ins, meaning how do we just sit down every week with the people that we work the most closely with and talk about how we're doing in an open group setting. So maybe it's kind of saying, hey, we want us to be vulnerable, and we're going to make time for it. And we're going to make time for it in a group setting where we're all here, instead of expecting that you're going to go find that peer relationship or that emotional need that you have. You're going to fill that elsewhere on your own time with someone else, and then therefore it creates silos. So I think that that would be a really good measure to put into place. Which leads me to some suggested improvements. So I've talked about calendars before. I really think that shared calendars and then the expectation that they are accurate is such a good cultural standard to have. I think I explained before why, but it just helps not only time management, but us to know if Tommy is out with Sally and a congregant sees them and then says to Bob, hey, Bob, did you know that Sally was having lunch with, I forgot his name. But then, you know, Bob can say, hey, yeah, I did actually know that. Or no, I didn't know that, but it was on their calendar and it says that they were talking about this and this. And so that's really helpful. There have also been so many times when I have forgotten what I had to go over with someone, or you know, oh, I remember that we talked about this a few weeks ago, but what was it? And I can go back in my calendar and see, oh, yep, I met them on the Tuesday here. It took 2 hours, which was a little longer than I thought. And then we talked about this, this, and this, and here, you know, so it's able to just jog my memory. So I think that's a really great improvement to have. Employee assigned / chosen mentor relationships. I think this is a great idea and something that I saw in, sorry, I'm pulling up my references here. I read about this in uh, Faults Between You and Me, Setting Work Non-Work Boundaries in the Context of a Workplace. So instead of assigning mandatory, like, hey, every new person is going to get this person as a mentor, sometimes, you know, relationships just do happen organically, and I think that that's great. And so for everyone to just have the expectation that they're going to be pouring into someone and someone's going to be pouring into them. And I know that at different size churches, this is probably a lot more doable than others. It's that would probably be very odd if it's a small church with only a few workers, but if it's a bigger church, this is something that I experienced at Eagle Brook, and it worked really, really great. So it was on me as a new employee to find a mentor, and that was great because I got to know other people who worked there and get to know them a little bit, and then ask them, hey, are you available to mentor me? And then people asked me that when they came in and I was a little farther down the line. And I learned so much from being able to give them guidance and just talk about, you know, how they're doing. And so those things were kind of, they were kept track of in a sense because my boss knew who my mentor was and who I was mentoring. And so those meetings were a lot more frequent on my calendar. And it was a leadership development expectation of mine, or of everyone that's there. So I thought that was a really great idea, and it could be opposite gender mentor, but then it's still on my calendar, and that relationship is kind of known about in the broader sense. Leadership-led vulnerability in group settings. This is really important because what leaders do and the questions that they ask show what they actually prioritize, what actually matters to them. And so when at my last church, Wayzata Free, when we would go around and talk about how we're doing spiritually, the two leaders were always the most vague, and always everything was great all the time, while other people would kind of try to slide in, you know, oh yeah, I'm starting, you know, counseling on the side, or I'm starting to read this book and this is what's convicted me. The leaders, unfortunately, never shared anything about maybe what they were learning or what they were struggling with. And so any vulnerability from others just felt kind of out of place, and it wasn't met with a sincere heart. And then another suggestion that I have is open invitation meetings. I think that this is a great concept because when we have meetings together, when I meet with my leader Brian, and I'm going to talk about a new kids programming idea that I have, and it's on my calendar. Pete, who works underneath me, can see that and know that our culture is just, he's allowed to come to that if he wants to. And so even if he has nothing to say, if he just wants to sit in and learn, he can totally do that. And I can see, you know, my boss, John, is having a meeting with the sound team because he's over them, and I know nothing about the video and sound, or like Sunday, I'm losing my word. And I don't know anything about that team. And so I can just come and I see it's on his calendar, and I'm allowed, without it being weird, to just come and say, hey, I saw that this was on a couple of your calendars and I just wanted to learn. So I'm just going to sit in on your meeting today. And so I think that that breeds teamwork. It breeds trust in one another. And it really helps us learn more about what's going on outside of just our little window. Monthly or bi-monthly one-on-ones for superior subordinate relationships. I think that this is absolutely vital. If you are someone's boss, you have a duty to know what's going on, what's going well for them and what's not going well for them. And to meet any less frequently, I think, than monthly, you're just going to miss out on too much, because we lived in such a fast-paced world. Things are changing all the time, and we need to be there for them and show that they're worth an hour of our time. So I think that's important. Posted office hours for congregation and staff availability. At Eagle Brook, this was something that we did, and I would suggest that Wayzata also implements this. The congregation needs to know, hey, when am I allowed to just stop in and see a pastor? And so maybe that looks like having a pastor on duty, so that whenever anyone, whether they go to the church or not, stops in, they're able to meet with a pastor if they need to. But also just kind of a regular culture of, oh, Fridays, no one's really in the office, but Thursdays, everyone is always in the office. And so if I need to make an appointment with someone, Thursday's usually going to be a great day to do that. And then it's helpful for staff also to know, yeah, I can look at their calendar and see when they're available to meet, but I know that Wednesdays everybody's going to be on site. And so then if we need to have a bigger meeting or a longer meeting, or combine some of our groups together, then Wednesday is probably a great day to do that. So I think that not only allows people to connect a lot better, which is important, but it helps take off some of the time that people could be spending one-on-one somewhere else, which then leads to disconnection or sometimes poor choices. Team shared workload, updates, and rewards. So I think that it would be so great if everyone had to present a yellow, red, and green activity bi-monthly to their larger team. So whether that's their whole campus team, or if it's a smaller church, just all the staff that are on their team, to be able to say, hey, this is something that's going really, really well this month. This is a green item. Here's a red item. Here's something I either had to stop, halt, or we're running into some trouble. And then here's a yellow item. Here's something I could use your help on. And that if everyone has to present those things, even if they're small, then it allows people to start learning how to ask for help and when that's appropriate. And it allows people to be rewarded or celebrated for the events that are going well, that they've worked really, really hard on, and you're able to kind of see that progression. And so I think that when teams celebrate together, again, that it breeds a team culture, instead of it being people needing to find that connection, because that's a true need of ours, which Henry Cloud talks about in his book Boundaries, of we have this need to be understood and to have intimacy. And so if we're not getting it in a broader setting at work, then we're going to try to find it in smaller settings at work. And that can be okay, but it can also lead to immoral behavior, which we've heard so much about on the news. I think that bigger churches have an HR department, which is great. And I think when that HR department is anonymous, that's really, really important. I've worked for a church that had a human resources department, but they were not anonymous. And so when I went in to talk, they would, say, oh, I met with this person the other day, and they shared some concerns about that too. And, that makes me feel then like, well, you're going to name drop me in a conversation. So I think that that's important for larger churches to have, but smaller churches need that as well. And so we're going to get to that in my next slide, but there needs to be some kind of way for concerns to be addressed in an anonymous fashion, because people aren't always willing or able to talk with their boss or talk with the right people about anything that they're concerned about. And in trying to do that and trying to find a safe outlet, that is oftentimes where gossip is bred or begun, and then things can just kind of snowball and blow up into something that really could have been addressed much easier with the proper parties. And then team-wide values and work-life expectations. I think that something that needs to happen at all churches is for teams to be able to sit down on a regular basis, so maybe twice a year, or maybe it's quarterly, and just talk about what are our values, what, here's the list that we've created. Do we want to add anything to this, or do we want to modify or take anything away from this? And values in terms of our work-life expectations. So, if maybe we're a church that is really diverse on age, and so we have a young mom who's on staff, and we have someone who's almost retired, and everywhere in between. And the person who's almost retired is needing to take care of their mom who has dementia, and the young mom has a sick kid, all winter long pretty much. And so what are we as a team valuing to put in place to help one another, because we all have these things. They just seem to come in season. So it's not everyone at once always needing boundaries to be set for them. But I think that when we can talk about that as a team, we are able to say, hey, we're all on the same page. We all want to help each other out. And so realistically, what does that look like? Maybe that looks like all of us are going to say we're not answering emails after 6 p.m. And so if we're not talking to each other, we're not talking to congregants after that. If it's an emergency, then they know which pastor is on duty or which pastor is on staff, or they have this number that they can call. But we're going to kind of set that cultural tone. So that would be like one example of a team-wide value between work-life expectations. Or, we all need a Sabbath, and so we're not going to work at all on these days. Or we understand that sometimes family members need to come into work. Maybe kids, we need, maybe for younger parents, having their kids being able to play in the nursery because their spouse is sick and they can't stay home, or they don't need to stay home with their kids. Those kind of things. Or even saying we don't want kids at all in the workplace or at church. That's just not an appropriate place for them. Whatever it is, as long as it's kind of team-wide and people we're able to put all those values on the table, talk about whether they're working for us, if we have any hesitancies about them. I think that would be a very good step to improve the cultural expectations around how can we make sure that we're being wise in our relationships with one another? Because if we're not getting enough time outside of work, then we become too close sometimes to the people inside of work, and that leads to poor choices sometimes. There would be behaviors that would be seen from a leadership level if we made those changes. And so initiative, not only on the leadership level, but all levels, for openness and collaboration would need to be seen. So that would be a new learned behavior. We would need to choose to collaborate and choose to be open. And so we need to talk about that. And then a team-led protection for one another, kind of going back to that values and work-life balance. How can we protect one another? And being able to reframe things in that perspective of, hey, we have windows on our doors in order to protect one another. because we want to be able to say, you know, yeah, I did see that they were meeting in there. Or we share our calendars and we stick to our calendar. And so if we realize, you know, we have nothing on our calendar for Tuesday, and so we go to the coffee shop. When we get to the coffee shop, we just put quick, like, hey, I'm at the coffee shop. Here's what you know, where I am on our calendar. Why? So we can protect one another. And I think that that's a much, that breeds trust instead of mistrust. And it assumes the best in one another. And then continuing learning and the behaviors that would be exhibited would be that we continue to learn and we continue to have opportunity to join areas of interest or areas where experience is needed. Like I said with, the production team, that was what the word I was trying to say. When I was able to join in on those meetings of the production team, then I was able to learn something that maybe I was interested in and I didn't necessarily need to know for my job, but I wanted to be able to get some more experience in that. Or when Pete was able to join in on my meetings about kids ministry that was a little bit above him, he was able to then say when he applied for his next role that was a step up, to say, yeah, you know, I've sat in on some of these meetings and here's what I've seen and here's what I haven't seen and here's what I want to do and change. And so I think that being able to provide intimacy in that level really allows us to continue our own development. And then the mentoring suggestion that I had of just pairing up and being able to have that expectation of I'm always going to be pouring into someone and I'm always going to have somebody pouring into me. That is leadership development right there. And you learn so much through that. That's a new behavior. And being able to provide leadership development opportunities in maybe more of a hands-on or official sense, such as having staff meetings once a month that are dedicated to providing the staff with communication skills or providing them with hot topics at the time that, you know, they've dropped in a comment box and said, hey, I need to learn how to lead better through this. Bringing in new speakers, that kind of thing. Those would be new behaviors that we would be seeing. And then open communication, I think, would be a huge new behavior for Wyzetta Free. Of if we're actually sharing and we see that our leaders are sharing and being vulnerable with one another, then we can feel like we're able to truly be vulnerable without being ashamed of that, but be vulnerable in the right places and in bigger group contexts where it is safer and we're not relying on one person to be everything for us. So like I said, leadership would have to increase their own vulnerability. They would need to share what they want to grow. So we need to talk about whatever it is that we want to see more of. We leaders, we would also need to be really skillful in our question asking. We need to make sure that we're asking questions often, that we're actually listening to the answer. We're not asking them just to prove our own points, but we're asking because we want to connect with the people underneath us and side to side with us. And that was another suggestion that, sorry, my computer keeps shutting down. In one of the articles that I was reading was talking about how question asking is kind of an art that's been lost and is starting to regain some traction. Hill, in his article about becoming the boss, that leaders need to make the change of wanting and craving a curiosity for what's happening around them and then how the people around them are doing. And I think that's really important in ministry, because as soon, again, as one person is ignored, like Cloud talks about, then they're going to go someplace else to seek it out. And so we don't want to be ignoring the people underneath us, because we're just too busy with our own life or with our own job. That is our job, is to ask questions and to be intentional with them and to say, hey, you're worth my time. And then another change at YZ Free would be delegation. Right now, there is this mentality of I need to do everything myself and not ask for help and not delegate, not say, hey, it is going to take more time in order for me to have one-on-ones with all of my direct reports each month. And it is going to take more time for me to kind of have to think for myself of how I'm doing, because maybe that's a skill that I don't have. And so in order for me to make time for all of that, I need to delegate a few things off of my plate and put them onto other people who maybe want to do them. And they don't necessarily need to be staff members. They can be congregates. So there are 5 practical action steps that I've come up with to help us create ethical, moral relationships in ministerial jobs, because again, there is this balance between we want to be one with one another as the church. We want to be open and we want to have rich relationships, but we also live in a day and age where too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And if we're too close to someone on our team, especially if they are the opposite sex, but even if they're the same sex, then gossip starts, or romantic feelings can start. And so we want to try to balance the two of those. And so here's just 5 practical action steps. I think that we need to celebrate inclusive behaviors. So every time at every staff meeting, weekly staff meeting that we have, we need to call out, hey, here's something I saw someone do that included other people that didn't need to be included. So here's somebody that joined a meeting just to learn. Or Mike asked if I wanted to go with him to a house visit so that I could learn how to do that. And that's not even part of my role, but I just really appreciated that he allowed me to come with him. And so just us having this mentality of like, all of us can do these things. We all want to learn. And so if we have the time on our plate, we want to be inclusive and not say, oh, that's something that always just Mike and John do. That's not something that like Karika would do. We don't want that to be the standard. So that would be one practical approach. The second is, I think it is absolutely vital to have one safe voice or a therapist on retainer. And so for larger churches, not only do we have HR departments, but at Eagle Brook, there was one person, his name was Byron, and he was assigned as the church's like safe voice. And so his role was I think it was director of leadership development. But no one reported to him, and he was very high up in the organization, but no one reported to him. And they did that on purpose because everyone could come to him. So the head pastor, and this is a church of like 200 staff. So the head pastor could come to him. His bosses even could come to him and talk with him. And anybody beneath him, or lower on the org chart could talk with him about anything. And he was that one safe voice, and he was amazing at never talking about or mentioning or alluding to what anyone said. But because he was there on staff, he was able to give great feedback about, oh, have you reached out to this person? Because they would be really, really great for you to maybe have as a mentor. Or, here's a book that I think that you should read. There have been, 10 people in the last 2 months who've had the same problem. So I would love to start a group that maybe meets once a month just to try to figure out what we could do about this. Would you be interested in being in that team? So that was sort of his role, and it was amazing. But at YZ Free, it's a much smaller church. So it's a staff of 20 people. And I think that for smaller churches, having a therapist on retainer, so being able to say, our staff is so worth, the health of our staff is so worth it to us that we're willing to pay a therapist who our staff can go to because they can't share any of the information that's shared with them. But having one person be that go-to therapist about work problems is would be so helpful, because then they can kind of have a broader understanding and picture of what's going on, and then they can make suggestions to the whole staff team of like, hey, this is something I'm hearing a lot of, but no one knows who's meeting with them, no one knows what's being talked about, but that person is there for work drama or work problems or frustrations. That would be a huge practical action step. The third one would be we need to maintain a zero tolerance policy on mentioning others in any negative sense without them being present. And so what that looks like is exactly that. If I'm going to go to my boss, Mike, and I'm going to say, hey, I had a problem with Pete. He, blah, 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 or even not say I have a problem, but just say, yeah, I mean, Pete's kind of whatever right now, and she's out of it. So I've been taking care of that. Don't worry about it. So like I'm now mentioning Pete in a negative sense, and he's not present. And so if my boss were to call me out and say, hey, you kind of just alluded to that something maybe isn't right with you and Pete, or maybe something just isn't right with Pete, I think that you should talk with him about that. And then I would like to know when you do that. And so just let me know like when you've had a chance to kind of talk to him, and then let me know if there's anything that I can do to help if maybe he's in a rough spot, or maybe he needs to go to a counselor. And so I think that once that happens enough, then we rob, in a healthy way, we rob information as power of Mike, the boss. Now he pretty much keeps saying, hey, I don't want to hear about other people unless there's such a big problem that the two of you are needing to come together to talk about it with me. And then I would love to be a part of helping you solve that. And so when Mike does that as the leader, he robs anyone beneath him of the power of information, or of knowing things, because he is now not mentioning other people. He's setting that boundary. So he's not mentioning other people in his conversations, and so they're not like, well, I kind of know where everyone stands with Mike. And he's robbing himself of the power of knowing, of being influenced by what other people feel about other people, because sometimes we don't even have a problem with someone. We just see that like, oh, well, if they're off, if Pete is off, and 3 people mention that Pete's kind of then now their boss, Mike, can have a bad taste in his mouth about Pete, when maybe Pete's just having a rough day. And so Pete might end up not getting a promotion because other people have minor issues with Pete that really just need to be solved with him directly. But because of this connotation, this negative connotation about him, Mike passes him up for a promotion, or doesn't give him the same kind of opportunities that he's giving his other direct reports. And so I think that rule just really allows us to set a good boundary around how intimate can we be, and then what are things that are, yeah, they're intimate, but they're just not appropriate, or they need to be addressed one-on-one. Set a calendar culture. I've already talked a lot about this, so I'll move on, but I think that's really important. And then lastly, the last practical action is we need to crave feedback. And that means we need to ask people for it, and it starts with the leaders. So leaders need to be able to say to their peers, to their direct reports, to their congregation, I want to hear your thoughts on X, Y, and Z, or give me one thing I'm doing great and one thing I could do better. Or in this one area of giving criticism, how do you think I could do better in that? And so when leaders start asking for feedback, then eventually people realize like, oh, they really are serious, and I'm not it's not taken out on me if I am honest with them. That doesn't come back to bite me later on. And so when that happens with leaders, not only do they learn a lot about themselves, but the people giving the feedback learn a lot about themselves, and they start doing that. It just becomes a culture. So those are 5 practical action steps that I think would be really, really important for Wise Out of Free to put into place in order to help have less negative, immoral relationships, and have more positive, healthy, vulnerable, intimate relationships. So some of the sources that I looked at are listed here, and I think that each one of them was just great and would recommend read. Thanks so much.